12 familiar foods are heading into 2026 with signals that are hard to ignore. One item has lost more than 90% of its production compared with its peak. Another crop is at its lowest level in more than half a century. One has lost nearly 30% of its acreage in just 1 year. And something that always seemed cheap, always available, is now facing pressure from a place almost no one would expect. What's concerning is that most of these changes have not yet shown up as empty shelves. They start quietly. Fewer choices, higher prices, a shorter selling season, or a familiar item suddenly becoming harder to find. And the farther down the list we go, the more surprising the reasons become. Because the item at number 1 is not disappearing from stores. What's disappearing first is the thing that once made people buy it without even thinking. 12. Black pepper and some imported spices. A small jar of black pepper sitting in the corner of the spice aisle almost never makes you stop and think. You grab it when the jar at home is running low, put it in the cart, then keep shopping for everything else. But small items like this can actually have one of the longest supply chains in the entire pantry. And in 2026, black pepper is showing why that matters. Vietnam is one of the most important sources of black pepper in the world. After this year's harvest was completed, production was estimated to be about 8 to 10% lower than the year before. Normally, 1 week crop would not be enough to make a spice disappear from the supermarket. The problem is what happened before that. Carryover inventory from previous crops was already at one of its lowest levels in years. That means when this year's harvest came in smaller, the market no longer had a large cushion to absorb the shortage. On top of that, some growers are not rushing to sell their supply right after harvest. When they expect better prices, they may hold on to inventory longer, tightening the amount that actually enters the market at any given time. Against that backdrop, Vietnam has also increased sourcing from Brazil, Cambodia, and Indonesia to support its export commitments. That is a detail worth paying attention to. One of the world's largest pepper exporting countries is having to look to other countries for additional supply, just to keep product moving. And before that jar of pepper appears on the shelf in front of you, it may have already passed through a farmer, collector, exporter, seaport, importer, processor, then a distribution center before reaching the retailer. That is a long journey for something that takes up only a few inches in the pantry. But this does not mean you will walk into a store tomorrow morning and find the entire pepper shelf completely empty. The changes are usually much quieter than that. A familiar size disappears first. A private label becomes harder to find. A brand is still in stock, but the price is higher, or the shelf is still full. Except there are fewer choices than there were a few months ago. For something used only a pinch at a time, a household may not even notice the price change right away, until the old jar runs out and they have to buy a whole new one. And black pepper is only one example. Some other imported spices also depend on growing seasons thousands of miles away from us, available supply at the source, and the ability to maintain enough inventory before the product reaches the supermarket. That is the paradox of the spice aisle. The smallest items in the pantry sometimes have to travel the longest distance to reach your kitchen. So if a few familiar spices start getting more expensive, the right size becomes harder to find, or fewer options appear on the shelf. The problem may have started long before the first shopper ever noticed. 11. Fresh pears. No one walks into a grocery store and asks, "Is there a pear shortage today?" You just walk through the produce section, look at the Bartlett's, Anjus, or Bosque, pick a few you like, then keep shopping for everything else. That is exactly what makes pears such a notable case in 2026, because a fruit can lose a significant share of its production without creating anything that feels like a crisis. On August 12, 2026, USDA forecast U.S. Pear production for this season at only about 650,000 tons, down roughly 15% from the year before. Even Washington, the largest pear-producing state, was forecast to fall by about 4%. That is a large enough decline to matter. But with fresh produce, the first sign is usually not an empty shelf. It is much more subtle. A familiar promotion no longer shows up. A display that once took up an entire section gets smaller. A seasonal variety leaves the shelf earlier than you remember. Or you still see pears this week, just not the exact variety, size, or ripeness you usually buy. That is how a smaller crop starts showing up in everyday life. A 15% drop in national production does not mean every supermarket will receive exactly 15% less. But a smaller crop leaves less room for a wide assortment, large displays, and promotions that run throughout the season. And that is when the word disappearing starts to mean something different. Picture the produce section you walk through every week. Early in the season, there are Bartlett, Bosque, Anjou, plus another seasonal variety. A while later, Bartlett and Anjou are still there, but Bosque is gone. The seasonal variety does not come back either. The shelf was never empty, but the selection quietly shrank. That is the part many shoppers may miss. You still see pears, so there is no reason to think supply has changed. But if the variety you usually buy becomes harder to find, promotions show up less often, or the selling season ends earlier, what goes into the cart starts to change. You choose apples, switch to grapes, grab a fruit that is on sale, or simply walk past the display this time. No shortage sign is needed. No scene of shoppers fighting over the last few pears. Just a few choices disappearing first. And that is exactly what makes fresh pears such a clear example of a kind of shortage grocery shoppers often notice only after it has already started. An item does not have to disappear from the shelf to start disappearing from your cart. Sometimes it only has to become harder to find in the right variety, show up for a shorter period of time, and make you choose something else instead. 10. Oatmeal and oat-based cereal. There are breakfast foods you buy because you like them. Oatmeal usually is not one of them. It sits in the pantry because it is cheap, simple, keeps for a long time, and always seems like it will be there when a household needs a quick breakfast without spending too much. But in 2026, the oat supply behind that familiar box is showing a weakness worth watching. Earlier in the year, USDA had forecast U.S. oat production at only about 55 million bushels, down 21%. By August, the picture had improved. Production was raised to about 68.4 million bushels, close to the year before, while total U.S. supply rose to about 172 million bushels. So U.S. oats are not suddenly disappearing. The part worth watching is Canada. USDA says most food-grade oats used in the U.S. come from Canada, while most oats grown domestically are used for feed. And this year, the Canadian crop is clearly getting smaller. Farmers planted only about 1.03 million hectares of oats, down 15% from the year before, and 21% below the 5-year average. This is the second lowest oat acreage ever recorded in Canada. Production for the 2026-27 season is forecast at about 2.94 million tons, down sharply from 3.92 million tons the season before. Total supply is also forecast to decline, while carry-out stocks could fall below 500,000 tons, the lowest level in 5 years. That is where a breakfast food that seems extremely stable starts to become worth watching. The raw material used for oatmeal, oat cereal, granola, and snack bars in the U.S. depends heavily on a crop north of the border that is getting smaller. That does not create an immediate shortage, but when food-grade oats get tighter, the changes can show up in very ordinary ways. A sale shows up less often, a family-size package loses its price advantage, a store brand is no longer as cheap as it used to be, or a household starts looking more closely at the price tag before taking oatmeal off the shelf. And that is the real risk with all-in 10. Oatmeal does not need to disappear from the cereal aisle. It only takes the cheap, simple, and dependable advantage that once made households buy it almost automatically to start disappearing. The box is still on the shelf, but it no longer goes into the cart automatically like it used to. 9. Honey looks like one of the most stable products in the grocery store. A small jar, no refrigerator needed, able to keep its quality for a very long time, and used in dozens of different ways. But behind that simplicity is a supply structure that is becoming increasingly dependent on what happens outside the United States. In 2025, USDA said U.S. domestic honey production reached only about 116 million pounds, down 14% from the year before. That is not the only number worth paying attention to. Producer stocks at the end of the year were about 34.8 million pounds, down 15%. While domestic supply tightened, the average price producers received rose from $2.41 to $3.05 per pound. That is an increase of about 27% in just 1 year. But the real issue appears when you look beyond U.S. apiaries. USDA's Economic Research Service says that in 2025, about 78% of the U.S. honey supply came from imports. India, Argentina, Brazil, and Vietnam were among the major sources. In other words, nearly 8 out of every 10 pounds of honey available in the U.S. market depended on production, weather, shipping, and trade in other countries. Meanwhile, people in the U.S. still use a lot of honey. Per capita consumption in 2025 was about 1.9 pounds per person. That was slightly below the record level in 2024, but over the long term, consumption has nearly doubled compared with 1990. So the more accurate way to say it is, long-term demand has risen sharply. Meanwhile, domestic production has moved in the opposite direction. USDA says domestic honey production is now only about half the level seen in the late 1980s. That is what makes honey worth watching. Imports themselves are not a bad thing. They help keep the product on shelves when domestic production cannot meet demand. But when import dependence reaches 78%, the domestic cushion becomes thinner. A weak harvest in a major exporting country, higher shipping costs, tariff changes, trade issues, or bad weather can pass pressure into the U.S. honey market much faster. And shoppers may feel that first, not through an empty shelf, but through a smaller jar, fewer choices, or a price that makes them leave it on the shelf. That is what is worth remembering about honey. It may not truly disappear, but when nearly 8 out of every 10 pounds of supply have to come from outside the United States, the price that determines whether a household is still willing to put a jar of honey in the cart depends more and more on what is happening far away from the grocery aisle. 8. Tomato sauce, tomato paste, and canned tomatoes. Processing tomato acreage in California is shrinking, and at first, that may seem far removed from the grocery cart. But this is one of those crops where, when production falls, the impact can spread across many products at the same time. Early in 2026, processors in California expected to contract for about 9.8 million tons of processing tomatoes. By late May, USDA raised the forecast slightly to about 9.9 million tons. That figure was still about 11% below the final contracted production level in 2025. The acreage is even more notable. In 2026, contracted acreage was down to about 185,000 acres. This is the third straight year that acreage has declined, and also the first time since the 1970s that California processing tomato acreage has fallen below 200,000 acres. The early year production forecast was also the lowest since 2005. However, one thing needs to be made very clear. The U.S. is not currently facing a nationwide shortage of processing tomatoes. The reason is that processors still have a fairly large cushion from previous inventory. As of March 1, 2026, tomato paste inventory, converted into its raw tomato equivalent, was about 7.04 million tons. That was 11% higher than the same time the year before, and the highest early March inventory level since the 2016-2017 season. Simply put, inventory is helping hide some of the current pressure, but planted acreage determines how much new supply will be available in the future. That is the part shoppers need to pay attention to. Processing tomatoes do not just go into a can of diced tomatoes. They are also used in tomato paste, pasta sauce, pizza sauce, ketchup, soup, and many other processed foods. So a smaller crop does not necessarily make one product disappear completely. The impact can show up in quieter ways. Fewer choices, fewer promotions, smaller package sizes, or higher prices across multiple tomato-based products at the same time. If the 2026 harvest goes well, current inventory could continue helping keep the market balanced. But if yields come in below expectations or inventory begins falling quickly, the pressure will become more visible. That is exactly what makes number 8 different. A smaller processing tomato crop in California does not just affect canned tomatoes. It can spread across an entire range of sauces, soups, and processed foods before finally showing up right inside the shopper's cart. 7. Chocolate made with real cocoa. The chocolate story in 2026 has taken a very notable turn. After cocoa prices surged in 2024, manufacturers had to find different ways to protect their margins. Some chocolate bars got smaller. Some products added wafers, fruit, or nuts. Some formulas used less cocoa or shifted toward cheaper substitute ingredients. The cocoa shock did not just change the price tag, it changed the product itself. But this year, the situation has reversed. Reuters reported that cocoa futures have fallen nearly 70% from their late 2024 peak. That decline is large enough that some companies have started putting more real cocoa back into their products. Hershey even announced plans to return some Hershey's and Reese's products to their original formulas after a period when extremely expensive cocoa forced manufacturers to make changes. On the surface, that sounds like good news, but the recovery is arriving just as the next crop faces new risks. Ghana expects cocoa production for the 2026-27 season could fall by at least 16%. Ivory Coast is also forecast to decline by more than 10%. Together, those two countries produce about half of the world's cocoa, and weather is becoming a major variable. Reuters reported that the probability of El Niño developing into a very strong event has exceeded 90%. Over roughly the past 55 years, strong El Niño events have hurt cocoa production. That is where the contradiction comes in. Just as manufacturers finally have a chance to bring back formulas with more cocoa, the raw material supply for the next season is becoming harder to predict. Meanwhile, shoppers in the U.S. still have not fully felt the benefit of falling raw cocoa prices. Major companies often buy cocoa under contracts months in advance, so commodity prices may fall today, while chocolate on the shelf still reflects ingredients purchased earlier at higher prices. Mondelez said, price increases meant to offset cocoa costs made shoppers more price-sensitive. Volumes fell, and more people shifted toward cheaper options. BLS data for July also showed that candy and chewing gum prices rose 9.6% from a year earlier. That is not an increase specific to chocolate. but it shows that the candy category has not fully escaped the costs that built up earlier. So the question with number 7 is not whether chocolate will still be on the shelf. It is whether the return of higher cocoa formulas can actually last. Because 2026 is creating a very strange contradiction. Cocoa prices have fallen enough for chocolate made with real cocoa to start coming back. But at the same time, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and El Niño are turning the next crop into a major question mark. 6. Peanut butter. This year, 1 acre of peanuts in the US is expected to produce more output. But the country could still harvest nearly 1/4 less than last year. It sounds contradictory. But that is exactly the contradiction sitting behind jars of peanut butter in 2026. USDA's August forecast put US peanut production at only about 5.42 billion pounds, down 25% from 2025. The reason becomes very clear when you look at harvested acreage. Last year, the US harvested about 1.91 million acres of peanuts. This year, the forecast is only about 1.37 million acres. That is about 540,000 fewer acres in just 1 year. Meanwhile, average yield is forecast at about 3,156 pounds per acre, which is 189 pounds higher than the year before. The peanut plants that are actually growing in the fields are expected to do fairly well. There are just far fewer peanut fields. Planted acreage this year is also down about 27%, showing that the contraction started before harvest season. There is one reason shoppers have not felt this clearly in stores yet. As of the end of June, commercial peanut stocks were equivalent to about 3.61 billion pounds, compared with about 2.12 billion pounds at the same point last year. Larger inventories are buying the market more time, but they do not make a crop that is 25% smaller disappear. June also shows how quickly that supply gets used. Peanut butter products alone used about 127 million pounds of food-grade peanuts during that month. This is where the numbers in the fields start to feel more familiar. Peanut butter is one of those foods many families buy almost automatically. The old jar is almost empty. A new jar goes into the cart. Jif, Skippy, or the store brand has been a familiar part of PB&J sandwiches, breakfast, or simple meals for decades. But 2026 is putting a significantly smaller production base behind that very ordinary shopping habit. Current inventory may help the market get through the early months without major changes. After that, the question will be how quickly old inventory falls, how much the actual harvest produces, and under what conditions processors have to buy raw material for the next cycle. A jar of Jif or Skippy this fall may still look exactly the same as last year. But the most important number to watch is not printed on the jar. It is the roughly 540,000 acres that no longer appear in the peanut harvest forecast, the way they did last year. The jar has not changed. The field changed first. 5. Orange juice. Florida did not lose one orange crop. It has lost most of the scale of an entire industry over more than 20 years. From the 2003-2004 season to 2023-2024, USDA estimates Florida orange production fell by about 92%. One bad season can recover. 2 decades of contraction tell a different story. Bearing orange grove acreage also declined by an average of about 3% per year over that long period. Citrus greening is one of the biggest reasons. The disease weakens trees, makes fruit smaller, causes it to drop early, and lowers yields. Add hurricanes, tree losses, and the rising cost of maintaining groves, and Florida citrus has gradually lost its ability to return to its former scale. The 2025-2026 season showed a little improvement. USDA's July forecast put Florida orange production at about 12.9 million boxes, higher than the April forecast. But put that number on a 20-year timeline. A small rebound does not erase the decline of more than 90% behind it. And the clearest picture of this change can be seen in two states. A generation of Americans grew up with Florida almost synonymous with orange juice. Today, California has surpassed Florida in total orange production. The state that once defined the image of American orange juice no longer holds the position it once did in the citrus industry. That does not make orange juice disappear. Companies can still use oranges from other regions, blend supply sources, or rely more heavily on imports. But the system behind a carton of orange juice is very different from the system that existed 20 years ago. That is why the Ultra 5 matters. Not because of one single forecast, but because we are looking at the result of 2 decades of continuous erosion. The orange juice carton is still sitting in the supermarket refrigerator, but the Florida citrus industry that once stood behind it has shrunk by about 92% in just 1 generation. 4. Flour, bread, and pasta. A loaf of bread, a box of pasta, a package of crackers, a bag of flour, a package of cookies. Looking at the grocery cart, they seem like 5 completely different products. But at the beginning of the supply chain, many of them start with the same thing: wheat. And the crop behind all of those products in 2026 is much smaller. USDA's August forecast put U.S. wheat production at only about 1.531 billion bushels. That is the lowest level since the 1970-1971 season. Total U.S. wheat supply is also forecast to fall about 13% from the year before. Part of the reason comes from the long-term decline in wheat acreage. The rest comes from drought damage to hard red winter wheat across the Great Plains. This type of wheat is especially important for many bread products. And while the crop outlook was getting worse, many foods in the same category were already more expensive than a year earlier. In July, bread was up 3.7%. White bread was up 4.0%. The rice, pasta, and cornmeal category was up about 3.9%. Those numbers do not mean the 2026 wheat crop caused all of those price increases. But they show that shoppers are entering a year with weaker domestic supply, while many basic foods are already more expensive. And wheat has one characteristic that makes it very different from the items before it. It does not occupy just one spot on the shelf. It follows shoppers through multiple aisles: bread for breakfast, pasta for dinner, crackers for snacks, flour for the kitchen, cookies and baked goods for the extras that go into the cart. Wheat is traded globally, and inventories still help balance the market. So the U.S. is not facing a situation where bread runs out. But when a domestic crop falls to its lowest level in more than half a century, that cushion gets smaller. A wheat crop does not have to disappear from the market for shoppers to feel it. Just one ingredient at the beginning of the supply chain can follow them through almost the entire grocery cart. 3. Coffee in 2026 is running on 2 clocks. One is in the commodity market, the other is in the grocery store. And right now, they are showing 2 very different times. In the global market, the situation has improved noticeably. USDA forecasts global coffee production for the 2026-2027 season at a record of about 189.7 million bags. Exports are also forecast to reach a record of about 131.4 million bags. Improved supply has pushed coffee prices in the commodity market down about 25% in 7 months. The first clock has started running backward, but at checkout, shoppers are still living with prices from the previous period. BLS data for July shows coffee CPI in the US was still 10.3% higher than a year earlier. Roasted coffee was up 9.4%. Instant coffee was up as much as 15.8%. That gap exists because the coffee on the shelf today was not made from this morning's commodity price. Companies have contracts that lock in purchases ahead of time. Then there is roasting, packaging, transportation, labor, and distribution. Commodity prices can fall months earlier, while retail prices are still reflecting older costs. And this year's timing makes it even more frustrating. Just as the commodity market clock starts giving people a reason to hope, a new risk appears. On August 21st, Colombia's coffee industry forecast that 2026 production could fall about 8%, from 13.7 million to about 12.5 million 60-kilogram bags. El Niño is seen as a bigger threat to the harvest than the recent earthquake. That creates a very strange window of time. The raw material just got cheaper. Store prices have not had time to follow, and the next crop already has another question mark hanging over it. With coffee in 2026, the problem is not that the two markets are moving in opposite directions. The problem is that the grocery store clock always runs behind, and the weather can change the story before it ever catches up. 2. Canned clingstone peaches. On this list, few items come as close to literally disappearing as canned clingstone peaches. Industry estimates for the 2026 season show California has only about 100 acres of bearing clingstone peaches left. A year earlier, it was about 13,250 acres. That is about 3,150 fewer acres in just 1 year. The largest year-over-year decline since the 2005-2006 period, if the current estimate is confirmed. USDA's August forecast also puts California's crop at only about 175,000 tons, down roughly 17% from 212,000 tons in 2025. This time, the decisive blow did not come from the sky. It came from the end of the supply chain, where those peaches were supposed to be canned. Del Monte Foods filed for bankruptcy in July 2025 and canceled multi-year contracts with growers. The company's Modesto plant once processed about 1/3 of California's clingstone peach production, equal to roughly 70,000 tons per year. Unable to find a buyer, the plant closed in April 2026. For a grower, losing a major processor means losing the place that takes the crop. And when that outlet disappears, long-established orchards start losing the economic reason to stay in the ground. USDA even supported a program to help growers remove clingstone peach trees after this shock. What makes this more serious is time. A seasonal crop can come back fairly quickly. But a new clingstone peach tree takes about 3 years before it starts producing enough fruit for commercial production. So when a bearing orchard is pulled out, people are not just losing this year's crop. Part of the supply for several future seasons leaves the system too. That is a rare chain of events. Processor closes, contracts disappear, growers pull trees, acreage falls. Future production capacity gets smaller. A cannery can disappear from the headlines after a few weeks. But a row of trees that has been pulled out leaves an empty space for much longer. And that is the image worth remembering about number 2. 1. Affordable beef. The meat case can still be full, and affordable beef can still disappear. That is why beef is number 1. In July 2026, ground beef in the US was 9% more expensive than a year earlier. And this is not just a problem with hamburger meat. Beef roasts were up 13.5%, steaks were up 9.6%, and the entire beef and veal category was up about 9.4%. Ground beef is the number that stands out the most. That is usually where a household turns when it wants to bring beef home without paying steak prices. Burgers, tacos, meatloaf, spaghetti sauce. 1 pound can stretch across an entire dinner. when that relatively accessible part of the meat case itself rises 9%. The problem has moved into the section many families use to save money. Behind those prices is a cattle herd sitting near its lowest level in about 75 years. USDA's July forecast put 2026 beef production at about 288 billion pounds. Fewer cattle also make the economics harder for meat packers. On August 13th, Tyson Foods announced it was closing facilities in Joslyn, Illinois, and Eagle Mountain, Utah, while selling its facility in Pasco, Washington. Tyson's beef division could lose as much as $650 million in 2026. Then, on August 21st, the story moved beyond the ranch, feedlot, and packing plant. It reached Washington. The president announced a temporary plan, allowing up to an additional 300,000 metric tons of ground beef imports into the U.S. at a lower tariff rate for 90 days. At the time Reuters reported it, the measure had only been announced, with an executive order expected to be signed afterward. That is how far the affordability story has gone. A product that was once a normal part of the grocery budget is now the subject of a 90-day emergency import measure. Beef does not have to leave the meat case. Steaks can still be there. Ground beef can still be there. But if the price that once made it easy for an ordinary family to bring beef home no longer exists, then the first thing disappearing is affordable beef. These 12 items do not tell one single story. Some are under pressure from weather. Some have lost production acreage. Some depend on outside supply. And some are still fully stocked on the shelf. But the price that once made people buy them without thinking is disappearing. The important thing is not to panic or start stockpiling immediately. It is to understand what is changing behind those familiar shelves. When crops get smaller, plants close, inventories shrink, or costs rise, shoppers are usually the last ones to notice. So do not just look at what is still on the shelf. Pay attention to what is quietly leaving your cart.